Welcome, everybody. My name is Ann Dolin, and tonight we're talking about improving your child's executive function skills without all the arguments this school year. You know, every day parents call my office looking for help for their kids, and they often say things like, "Oh, last year with virtual learning, it was such a disaster. I'm really worried that my child won't be able to keep up this year." They'll often say, "It seems like he has no idea what's coming due. Like things come out of nowhere and they're due the next day. He's wildly unprepared." Other parents will say, "I feel like I have to stay on top of my daughter just to get anything done. And I have two other kids to deal with." Now, on the other hand, kids are saying, "I got this, Mom. Don't worry. Don't micromanage me. I'll do it eventually. Don't worry, I promise. I'll turn it in." Do those things sound familiar in your house? Well, it's easy to think when kids have difficulty planning a task and basically focusing enough to execute it and get it done and then turn it in. When they have difficulty with those things, we often think maybe it's a motivational problem. They just don't care. Maybe they're just not good at school. But in reality, there's something else going on. In fact, we have these mental processes behind the forehead in the front of our brain. This is called the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is extremely important for school success. But you know what's so fascinating about the frontal lobe? It's the last part of the brain to develop. As infants, your brain develops in the back towards the front. And in fact, this frontal lobe area doesn't even fully develop until somebody's in their mid-20s. Yet, it's the part of the brain we need the most for school. So this frontal lobe is responsible for these cognitive processes we call executive functions. I kind of think it's a fancy term for study habits. So actually there's 8 executive functions, but for tonight, just because we don't have a lot of time together and I want to talk about the ones that have the most impact on school, we're going to talk about the first 3. And maybe if we have time, we'll touch on all the others because they're important too. But here are the first 3. Inhibition. This is your ability to bat away distractions from your phone or your little brother playing on the other side of the room and get your work done. Focus well enough. Initiation. Making yourself get started on a task you deem to be boring or difficult, which is really hard for people with ADHD. The next one is planning and organization, knowing the steps you have to do and being organized enough to get the task done. Here are all the other ones. Self-monitoring, basically self-awareness. Working memory, that's juggling all the things you have to do in your mind. Shifting, putting down Xbox, starting math homework. Materials organization. 5 years ago, it was binders, backpacks, folders. These days, it's digital files and keeping all that organized. And lastly is your emotional control, keeping it all together without having a breakdown or ending the night in tears or lots of drama. Those are all executive functions. So when we see that our child has difficulty with these things, as parents, we have 3 choices. We can ignore the behaviors and think, you know what, your brain will finally catch up with you, maybe when you're 25 or something. So you'll just grow out of it. You do you, I'll do me. I already went to 6th grade. You figure this out on your own. We can micromanage it or we could support it. So if we ignore the issues, are they really going to go away? Will our child simply grow up? And the answer is no. Kids still need support along the way. They need scaffolding. Oh, here's another option. We could micromanage the heck out of it. That means when our child gets home from school, we can say, let's check your homework portal and see what you have to do tonight. All right, I'll make a list for you and I will sit next to you so you get everything done. And then I will check it off to make sure it's all complete and I'll watch you upload it so I know that it's turned in. That would be the other extreme of ignoring it. We don't want that either. We don't want ignoring or micromanaging because there's this thing called the negative behavior cycle. And a cycle of negativity is really bad for kids. Here's what happens. When kids aren't doing well in school, and even other things around the house, like following through on chores or keeping their room clean, they get criticism from others. At home, it's parents. Outside of school, it might be a coach. In school, it could be their teachers. And then what happens? Well, they have lower confidence and they think, why bother? I can't even really do that well at this stuff anyways. So they put forth reduced effort. That's another word for avoidance. We've all seen it in our kids. They choose to do nothing to save face. And then this reduced effort results in a negative behavior or a grade, usually a lower grade in school. Well, what happens after that? The cycle repeats itself. More criticism from parents, teachers, lower confidence, reduced effort and avoidance, and bad grades. We want to break that cycle. So if we pick A or B, that cycle work will continue. Instead, we want to consider supporting our kids with some structure. So what does that look like? Well, two things. First, it means changing our mindset as parents. Because I tell you what, we can't change our kids' behavior. We just can't. The only thing we have control over as parents is to change our own behavior. And that starts with noticing the good things our kids are doing. I'm going to talk more about that later on. But right now, I want to talk about having structures in place. Because here's the thing, kids with weak executive function skills, they don't have a lot of internal structure. Like, gee, I should do this, this, and that, so I'm ready for this other thing. Or I'll do this first, this second, and this third. They don't think like that. So instead, they need external structures to help them be a little bit more organized and to help them follow through. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to share with you 6 strategies that can really help. Now, 3 are for structure that I talked about, and then 3 are helping kids to focus and finish. So let's get started and talk about Sunday, because actually it's a super important day. And there's a reason it's the first day of the week. And for kids, I would argue Sunday is the most important day of the school week. And here's why. On Sunday, if you can sit down with your child and take time to preview their week ahead, they're going to know what to expect and they're going to be a whole lot more prepared. They're not going to go to school on Monday really thinking not about what they have to do for the week, just instead of showing up. This way, if you take time to preview the week ahead, they're going to know what to expect and they're going to be prepared. Now, previewing the week ahead means that on Sunday night, maybe after dinner, you sit down with your kids and you say, let's talk about the week ahead. Now, depending on the age of your child, you're going to do one of 2 things. If you have young children, I'm talking elementary school, you might want to consider a type of calendar on your refrigerator. This is an example of a weekly planner magnetic calendar. And I like this idea because in this once a week time frame, on Sunday evenings, you're going to gather your little kids around and you're going to say, let's talk about the week ahead. You're going to go to the planner and you're going to take your schedule and you're going to say, okay, Susie, on Monday, you have piano at 5. Let me write that down. And Sarah, you have soccer at 6. Let's write that down. So even if you're not that organized yourself and keeping up with something like this might be hard, now you've got a built-in meeting where you do it with your kids and you talk about the week ahead. Little kids love to preview together. They love to know what to expect, and their behavior is a lot better when they're prepared. So you talk about the week ahead, talk about the weekly planner, and then ask, do you have any test quizzes, other big assignments coming up? This is when kids can take out their assignment book, their agenda book, look through it and see, do they have any tests coming up? And that's when you can say, what would be your first step in getting prepared for that? So you're basically starting a dialogue and asking them how they're going to prepare for that task coming up. Now, this is for young kids, and it can work for older kids too. But in general, as kids get older, they tend to keep their own calendars, which is really what we want them to do. So here's an example of one that we did with an older student, put all of our classes in it. And in the top for all day appointments, we had her put what is due that day. And this is super helpful for kids, older students, to have a list of their assignments on their calendar instead of on a list that's written down somewhere. Task lists are hard for kids. They are much better when information is actually on their calendar. We also use Google Keep for kids of all ages, especially high schoolers, where everything is electronic for them. Younger students might still have that good old-fashioned agenda book. They might still have binders and folders. But for older students, middle and high school, most everything is electronic these days. So Google Keep is an amazing product that a lot of students already know how to use because it's part of the Google Suite, which they grew up with. So if you haven't used Google Keep, it's kind of like a fun way of keeping good old-fashioned Post-it notes, which we all love. It allows kids to color code things, move them around on their deck to show, and it helps to show them, I want to get this done, and this done on this day. This is the order of things. These things in this color are the most important. And we found that kids really like Google Keep, and it's something they will use. And I found that using software that they're already experienced with has a much better rate of success than using something different that they may not know about. They really are creatures of habit. Other things that can help our kids to plan ahead are modeling how you preview your week. So for example, let's say you go to an office. You might say to your kids, all right, I'm going to make my lunch for tomorrow. While I'm doing this, you get your snacks ready for tomorrow. They can either make their lunch for school or maybe they prepare their own snacks for after school. You might say, when I look at my calendar for the week, I confirm my appointments. Tomorrow, I have a meeting, an HR meeting with Mary. I'm going to write to her right now just to confirm that. You might lay out your clothes, whatever it is. So all these things help kids get ready for the week. Okay, so let's talk about how this is going to work on a daily basis. We have the whole week previewed. How do we get our kids to do their work after school in time, on time? Often parents will complain to us that their kids are staying up really late, especially in high school, doing their homework. And they're concerned about their stop time. To me, what's more important than a stop time is a start time. So when we work with kids on executive functions, when we look at their calendar with them and we put in all their extracurriculars, when we work with them once or twice a week, we'll be looking ahead to ask them, okay, tell me about your day here. You have this and that after school. What's your start time? Now, for young kids, elementary kids, you can either start homework right after school or after about a 30-minute break. Now, the 30-minute break can be after school. It might be when you pick your child up from aftercare. They still get a 30-minute break, and then they're expected to help start homework. 30-minute break is a good option for elementary kids. But for older kids, they have lots of options too. They can start before dinner, after dinner, before bed, before school. Kids recently said, we forgot about on the bus to school and the study hall right before the class, which are all possibilities. But in general, as kids get older, we want to encourage them to start before dinner. Even if they actually don't do their work, but they open up their laptop and they look to see what they have and they create a little list of what they're going to do. That's starting, and getting them to get started before dinner is really powerful. It prevents them from staying up too late. So we have the time. Let's talk about the place. Kids should have a dedicated area for doing their work. It even doesn't have to be the same place day in and day out. It could be a couple of different places. That's fine. But they should have a place that's kind of quiet-ish. For younger students, elementary, doing homework in their room is not conducive for focus. You generally want them in a place where you can kind of look over your shoulder and see that they're within earshot. So for those students, it could be you're working in the kitchen and they're in the dining room. But wherever it is, make sure that they have simple things in their study area. It could be a whiteboard, a fancy one like this one, or it could just be a little whiteboard that they keep at their desk. It could be post-it notes for them to jot down notes for themselves. Older students, instead of this, they might use Google Keep. But I've found whiteboards overall to be very successful for students. So we've talked about the Sunday session previewing the week, the time and the place. Let's discuss some strategies for focusing and for finishing. So when I think of focusing and finishing, I often think of just getting started in the first place. And here comes procrastination. It's easy for parents and teachers to think when kids put things off, it's because they don't know, they just don't want to do it. But actually, there are 3 reasons kids procrastinate, and adults too, for that reason. The first is they actually know how to do it, but they don't want to. And we make this assumption that this is what is going on. Our kids simply do not want to do the task. But actually, that's typically incorrect. Oftentimes, kids with ADHD and executive function weaknesses are really overwhelmed and underprepared, and they do not know how to get started because the task feels so daunting to them. Even if it might feel easy to us, it's not to them. And then here's the other category that we see more and more these days. And this is kids with anxiety, which leads to perfectionism. And these are kids that don't want to start, they prefer to avoid because they're worried that their end product won't be perfect. It won't be good enough. So when you're that anxious, your MO is to avoid. And that feeling of avoidance and putting things off can actually make us feel better at first, but over time, over hours, it really weighs us down and makes kids even more anxious. So when we work with students on executive functions, we want to teach them strategies so that when they get in this situation on their own, they know what to do. So let me share with you some strategies for getting started and to keep going. We often recommend that in addition to a whiteboard and post-it notes, kids have a timer in their space. This is called a time timer. And I really like this one actually, because the red disc moves and minimizes so kids get a sense of elapsed time. It could be a good old-fashioned kitchen timer. It doesn't really matter. Ideally, it's not your phone because it's easy to go down the rabbit hole of a group text when you just want to use the timer. So here's how you use a timer. You set it for super short amounts of time. I call this 5 minutes of fury, even for college students. Okay, you don't want to do this task. You know you're about to procrastinate. Here's an option. You set the timer for 5 minutes and you say to yourself, I'm going to work as hard as I can, as best I can, focus as much as I can, just for 5 minutes. And when the timer goes up, I'll get up. I can take a break if I need to. Usually they can keep on going. We call this 5 minutes of fury. It can be the tolerable 10. Anybody can tolerate anything just for 10 minutes. Or you take your child's age and you add 1. That's a good starting point, but not more than that. So again, this is a super small way to give you that oomph to get started. When you don't have that internal oomph, the timer gives you an external oomph. Now, you can also use timers another way. You can use timers for broader swaths of time. And this is really important for older kids, not so much elementary, but definitely maybe 6th grade, 7th, 8th, throughout high school, definitely college. And this is super popular with adults too. It's called the Pomodoro Technique. It was actually created, researched in the 80s by an Italian learning scientist who wanted to figure out, all right, when people want to focus on something that's hard, what is their sweet spot for attention? How long can they attend to the task without losing motivation? Is it 10 minutes? Is it 90 minutes? Is it an hour? What is it? And interestingly, the researcher is this Italian fellow who did the research in the 80s using the tomato timer. And in Italian, tomato is Pomodoro, hence the name Pomodoro Technique. There's even a whole book on it. He found it's actually 25 minutes. So for these kids, we'll often talk to them about, all right, when you feel like you're going to procrastinate, if you can get going, just use that short amount of time. But sometimes you might need to write an essay, or you have to do a DBQ, or you have to do something that like requires a lot more longer focus. So you set the timer for 25 minutes, same mantra. I'm going to work as hard as I can, best I can, focus as much as I can, just for 25 minutes. And here's how it works. You do one Pomodoro, you take a 5-minute break. If you're able, you do another Pomodoro and take a 5-minute break. And I found for kids, that's about as much as they can tolerate in a row. But for older students, college and adults, the researchers have found that the human brain can only really take 4 Pomodoros in a row. Here's what it looks like. Pomodoro, break, Pomodoro, break, Pomodoro, break, Pomodoro. All right, let's switch gears. We talk about getting started. Let's talk a little bit about ways we can help our kids focus and finish. Now, let me share with you some website blocking apps. These can be helpful for kids, and they don't always work if the school system doesn't allow certain software. But if they have a personal computer, their phone, they can use these. So one is Stay Focused. It's just for math. And then the other one is called Self-Control. Sorry, Stay Focused is a Chrome extension. Self-Control is just for math. And then the other one, Focus Booster, can be used for any type of, for Mac or Windows. And they all do primarily the same things. They allow kids to blacklist the websites they deem to be distracting, and they always know what they are. Typically one is YouTube. And set a timer for a specific amount of time that they want to stay focused. The one I like the most right now is actually Focus Booster, because it's based on the Pomodoro Technique of 25 minutes. So once kids learn Pomodoro, they automatically kind of gravitate to Focus Booster. And then this is the version for the phone. This is called Forest, and I love Forest. Actually, a student in middle school at Robinson told me about Forest many years ago. And I even use it on my own phone when I feel like I'm really getting distracted with my phone. So with Forest, it's really cool. Basically, you click the app and a tree starts to grow on the home screen of your phone. And you set your toggle bar, you can see it around the circle on the left, for a specific amount of time. Maybe you set it for 20 minutes, maybe 25. And then during that time, this tree will grow on your home screen and you'll see the time inching down. But if at any time you go to Snapchat or Instagram or TikTok and you're playing around on other apps, Forest will give you a warning. And if you don't get out of those other applications, your tree will wither and die. Nobody wants a dead tree. Kids want their tree to grow to fruition, to be planted in their forest. And then the app will ask them, do you want to stay focused again? So they can go again. But it's super motivating because after a certain number of trees, the company actually plants trees in a real forest, and kids love that. So we've talked a lot about ways to keep kids focused, but what about those kids that feel super anxious and they don't want to get started because they're feeling overwhelmed? How do you deal with this feeling of anxiety? You know, so often we use the same technique. Just get started. It will be fine. Don't worry. Why are you worrying so much? None of those things work. Instead, it may require sitting down with our kids and saying, all right, let's see all the things you have to do. And let's code these into 3 specific groups. So the must-do assignments are the things that are really important. So we ask kids, what is so important here that it's going to really impact your grade and it's due tomorrow? Let's code that one a must-do. Okay, great. What are the ones that are a should do? Meaning, yeah, you should do it, but you know what? It's not due tomorrow, or maybe it's not at all part of your grade. Basically, it's important, but not that important. It's a should do and doesn't necessarily have to be done that day. Could do's are kind of like nice to haves. Maybe they're extra credit. Maybe it's you've already studied for an hour for a science test. Do you really need to continue to study for another hour? Maybe not. That could potentially come off your list. So for anxious kids, just saying, okay, wait, I had 10 things and now I have 2 things. This feels a lot better to me. I'm much more willing to get started. So we'll teach kids to do must do, should do, could do, so that they're able to do it on their own as well. So what are your next steps as a parent? Really, you want to just choose one strategy. You do not want to do all these things with your kids. It's too much, and they'll totally push back against you. Some kids are open to overtures from parents, but some aren't. Sometimes kids will listen better to somebody else. I found that with my own kids who are now in college. It's just kind of human nature. Other people don't have that emotional history with kids like mom and dad. So if you decide that you want to find somebody else to help, I can share with you what an executive function coach does. This is how we teach it. People probably do it in different ways, but this is what we found to be successful. There's 2 types of coaching. There's an executive function coach, and this is somebody that will work with your child to say, all right, let's look at all your subjects. Let's go onto your portal, Canvas or Schoology or whatever your portal is, and let's pull up science. And we're going to look at science. What are all the things coming up? And we're going to calendar them. Let's look at math. What are all the things coming up? We're going to calendar them. So it's for each class. So the student has an overview of everything that's coming up. And then they've put it into their calendar in a task list. That's what an executive function coach does. And they help kids overcome their reluctance by getting started on those hard assignments and give them strategies when they're working independently. Whereas you can also find a tutor who can weave in executive functions. Let's say your child's having difficulty with math. You can say, look, I want the tutor to help with math, but also weave some executive functions in, like how to study more effectively, how to deal with anxiety around math, how to look at what's coming up and break that big assignment or that big test down in smaller parts with my child. That's basically tutoring with some executive function. But if you want to go it alone with your child, I would recommend starting with a conversation, not saying to your child, hey, Jimmy, I was on this webinar with this lady and she said to do this. And so that's what we're doing. It's not going to go over well. Instead, treat your child like an adult. Say, can we talk tonight after dinner? How is 7:30? So you're basically setting up an appointment for a conversation. And you're doing it when calmer heads prevail. You never want to enter a conversation with a child when you're upset, when you see that they haven't done something that's due the next day, or they had test corrections that could have raised their grade, but they chose not to do it. They have missing work. That's never a great time when you're upset and they're upset to talk about what's next. So when you want to start a conversation, I recommend starting with the words I've noticed. I love these words. It really takes the onus off the child. It's hard for kids when we say things like, you're not focused, you're not following through, you don't seem to care. Using the word you to kids feels like, okay, forget it. I'm checking out of this conversation because I'm about to get lambasted. Instead, if we say, I've noticed, all you're doing is merely judging or merely noticing a behavior. So you might say, I've noticed it's hard to stay on top of things. So you're not accusing your child of not doing his work. You're just noticing it's hard to stay on top of things. There's no you in the statement. Or for math, I've noticed equations are really hard. And then you want to say, tell me about that. And that's it. Your job when you open dialogue with your child about schoolwork is to be a really good listener, not to give advice and not to pass judgment. So by saying, tell me about that, hopefully your child will say something like, I really don't understand the math. My teacher goes too fast. It's just so hard. I can't understand what he's saying. I'm having a hard time following along. That's great. It's great that your child's talking to you. And in that case, you want to say, I get it. I can tell why that's difficult. Tell me more. You're basically nodding. you're listening, and you're empathizing. Now, on an ongoing basis, you want to ask powerful questions instead of telling kids what to do. When kids have gotten in this cycle of negativity in the past, telling them what to do didn't work before, and it will not work this year either. So instead of asking questions where you might already know the answer, like, do you have homework? Which should be yes, and sometimes they say no. For a younger student who has a continuity of always having math or spelling and spelling the same night, you might say, will you do math or will you do spelling first? You might say, what is the one thing you need to get accomplished tonight for older kids? So again, they might have three things, but all you're saying is, what's the one thing you want to get accomplished? Don't worry if your child doesn't come at you and say, well, let's see, Mom, I've got math. I got to do that science lab, and I really need to finish the English essay. It's not going to happen. Kids will not be overly verbal to you, but it might kind of get that executive functions fired up to start thinking, let me prioritize. What is that one thing to get accomplished? So basically you're saying, if you had to do only one thing tonight, what's the most important thing you want to get done? So a question like this is really good for kids that tend to procrastinate a lot and those who are overly anxious. Here are some more. Did you study for your science test? That's not a great question because it's yes or no. Here's another one. Here's what you could say instead. What's the first thing you might do to get ready for the science test? Again, you're asking for steps. Instead of, you better start that history project, young lady. Try. What's something small you can do to get started on that history project? Instead of, are you ready for your spelling test? You could say, after dinner, would it be helpful if I read the words to you and you wrote them down? That might be helpful for a younger student. I also love using something called a success rating scale. And this was actually done by a fellow named Jerome Schultz, and he wrote this great book called Nowhere to Hide about why kids with ADHD don't love school. We know a lot of them. And I've used a rating scale typically on a scale of 1 to 10 for many years, and I found it to be super helpful for kids. And I've asked kids, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling about their English assignment? And I like that because they'll give me a number. They'll say something like 7. And I'll say, oh, tell me about that. And then we can have a dialogue. So I'm not asking if they did this or they did that, because that feels like nagging. Kids don't like it when their coach or their tutor does that. They are willing to have a dialogue with you with an open-ended question. So anyways, this one's a little bit different. It's on a scale of 1 to 5. So 1 means it's super easy, and 5 means it's ridiculously hard for me. So I actually used this with a college student the other day. She's a transfer student. She had a hard time her freshman year, transferred to a new school, and she's only been in school for, I think she's been in three weeks now, and she's already feeling behind. She had a list of, she knew what she had to do, but she had no system for doing it, which is, we see, it's kind of common in kids at the end of the year. They haven't gotten behind yet, but we know they will because they're on the system. So I said to her, what is your hardest class? Like, which class is keeping you up at night? Which one are you most worried about? And she said, it's this film and education class. And I said, okay, can you pull it up? And she pulled up the syllabus and we looked through it together. And I said, okay, on a scale of 1 to 5, how difficult do you rate these assignments? And she said, really about a 3. And I said, what is, on a scale of 1 to 5, what is your motivation to do it? And she said, it's a 5. Like, I just really am not motivated. And when anybody when a child tells anybody that they're not motivated to do something, it doesn't matter how easy or hard the assignment really is. If the child's level of motivation is out of whack, then we've got a problem. Ideally, as educators, we're looking for about a 3 and a 3. We're looking to see that, yeah, the assignment, it's not super easy, it's not super hard, it's just kind of challenging in the middle. And the motivation to do it should kind of be in the middle too, or good. But when it's a 4 or 5, that spells trouble. So when we see kids with a 4 or 5, it means their brain, their frontal lobe is going into this flight or fright or even freeze method of operation. That means that they're thinking, oh my gosh, I do not know what to do. I'm feeling overwhelmed by this. I totally don't want to do it. I'm going to totally avoid it. I'm going to argue with the person who's helping me with it, or I'm just going to freeze and not do anything at all. And if this happens with your child, you don't want to say something like, what do you mean you're a 5? You're not motivated? What's it going to take you to get motivated? You can do this. Come on, Jimmy, you really can. I have faith in you. None of those things work. Instead, you want to say to your child, oh, you're a 4. Oh, you're a 5. Tell me about it. You want to get them out of this flight, fright, freeze cycle of negativity thing. You want to ask them just to tell you about how they're feeling. Because when kids can share with you their feelings, they're more able to think clearly about what their first step is going to be. And then you ask the question, I get it. I can see why that's difficult. What might be your first step? Or if your friend had this work to do, what might you share with him would be a good first step? Sometimes kids like solving other kids' problems. So if any of this could be helpful for you, this would be using I've noticed, the powerful questions, the success rating scale, any of these techniques for communication. I've compiled it into a 2-page document for you, even with little scripts of exactly what to say. And you can get that easily by just texting. Grab your phone right now and you can text 55444 and just type in the word communication, lowercase or capital, doesn't matter, and it will come straight to your inbox. So again, 55444 in the word communication. So a couple of other suggestions. As much as possible, avoid why questions. Why questions are really tough for kids because they require a lot of critical thinking and they often engage in tons of conflict. So when we say something like, why didn't you turn that science lab in? We're actually looking backwards, and looking backwards with kids, they check out. It's not helpful. So instead, forget about that. It's done. You might say, do you have anything coming up in science? Instead of, I don't understand how you can already have missing assignments. It's only September. You might say, I noticed there are some missing assignments. What's your first step into tackling them? Again, helping kids break it down. So here's lots of ways that you can take a why and turn it into a what that kids are more receptive to. And again, all of this is in the resource pages that I compiled for you. Now, here's the thing. This is all easier said than done. It sounds like, oh, I can do this. I have this under control, but it's hard. It's hard because again, we can only change us. We can't change our kids. So we've got to know this is going to be difficult. And it's especially going to be difficult because we've been out of practice. Our kids have been out of school for 1.5 years. They're just getting back into the swing of things. And life is going to be harder for them. They're just getting that momentum going again. So you can expect some glitches here and there. But regardless of what happens early on in the year, here's what I want to leave you with. And as we wrap up, if you take away one thing from this presentation, here's what I want it to be. For the next 30 days, so today is September 20th. So until October 20th, I want you to focus on one good thing every day that your child does. It can be related to academics, but it doesn't have to be. So you might say, I love how you started your homework before dinner, or what a great idea, writing all those steps out of your math problems. I can tell you're really working hard on that science project. You're basically noticing what they're doing. You're not admiring them for a grade, like, wow, you're so smart. You got an A on that science test. I told you you were just as smart as your sister. None of that stuff. We want to notice their effort, their behavior. So focus on one good thing every day for 30 days. And here's why. At the end of the day, and 10 years from now, our kids will not remember what they got in algebra that first quarter, what their science grade was on their first test. They will not recall, but they will recall what life was like after they were out of school for 18 months and went back to school. They will remember the feeling. They will remember the relationship we have with them. So at all costs, we really want to preserve our relationships with our kids, and focusing on the good things they do is at the top of the list when it comes to academics. So Kathleen, I hope this was helpful. I'd love to take some question and answers. And just to remind everybody, my name is Ann Dolin. I'm very accessible. If you have a question that is not answered tonight, you can reach me at Ann, A-N-N, at ectutoring.com. My website has a blog, which has a ton of great articles. You can go into the search engine and type whatever you want, executive function, ADHD, whatever, and you'll see articles about it. And my website is ectutoring.com. If you want that resource guide I mentioned, just text 55444 in the word communication, and it will come straight to your inbox. So Kathleen, I'd love to turn it over to you. Is it okay if we go to Q&A right now?
Yeah, absolutely. We do have some questions. I think the first question that several people had was, is there a way for them to get the recording after this is over?
Yes, I have recorded it, and I will download the recording and I will send it out to everybody that's registered.
Okay.
Or Kathleen, you can. Either way, we'll make sure that all the parents get it.
So yeah, stay tuned, everybody. If you subscribed, you will definitely get the recording after. Somebody had a question, Ann, about what the Pomodoro's duration would be expected for a Montessori preschool child.
I wouldn't use Pomodoro for a really young student because Pomodoro, the research is based on 25 minutes. So but that doesn't mean you can't use a timer for little kids. In general, an easy way of thinking of it is take your child's age and add 1. That's basically what they're going to be able to sustain consistently. So if you have a 5-year-old, I would start by setting a timer for 6 minutes and be really clear about what they're going to do so they understand what they're going to do, set the timer. If you find, and some parents will say, timers make my child anxious. If you find that that's the case, then do not use a timer. Instead, change what you're doing and do it by task. So if you want to break something down, and let's say it's, I don't know, your child has to write 20 spelling sentences. They hate to write, which is super common with kids with ADHD. You might say, write 5 sentences, and then you can take a break. So it doesn't have to be by time. You can also break it down by task.
Okay. Another parent asked whether you would recommend watching a recording of this meeting with children ages 7 and 11 and a half.
Sure, if they can sustain attention for this long, it's probably about 45 minutes, then more power to you, yes.
And I think all the visuals might be nice. You know, kids can see like, oh, we'll try this cool calendar because Ann's so great at sharing those visuals.
Yeah, I often share a lot of things with kids, and I'll say, you know what, this might work for you, it might not. You know, and just by saying that, they're like, well, what is it? You know, they're like really curious. And you can show them a couple of things, see if anything resonates.
And I think there was a follow-up question while talking about kids is how to get young children ages 7 to 11 and a half to be self-advocates.
You know, that is such a developed skill, and it's something we want for all of our kids to, you know, raise your hand, you know, ask the teacher in the chat a question, email the teacher. And it's super hard because kids feel like they just feel like they're the only one doing it, that nobody would ever reach out to a tutor or to a teacher. So why should I? So what I've often done with kids that are super shy about asking for help is I've worked with them to compile the email. So I often ask, and I have kids ask, especially when they're older, to the teacher, what's the best way to correspond with you? Is it email? Do you want me to message you through the website? Like, how do you like to be corresponded with? And if they say email, then you and your child wants to ask a question, you help them write the first email. Hi, Mrs. Smith, I'm really stuck with reducing fractions. I'm wondering if you could help me after school tomorrow. Would that work for you? because the minute your child gets a positive response from a teacher, then they're more likely to do it again. You'll probably have to guide them again, but if they can do it a couple times with you, they're more likely to do it on their own later on.
Great. Another question is, what would tips be for parents whose kids at age like 6th grade seem to be doing okay so far? How do you keep things on track?
I love 6th grade. I used to teach 6th grade. It's one of my favorite grades. I would just keep checking in with them. How are you doing? Tell me how are you feeling about school? Not just how are your grades, but how are you feeling? On a scale of 1 to 5, what's your motivation level? Do you feel like you're able to keep up? And just keep the dialogue going. If your child, and you can also go to the homework portal once a week with them if you're worried. So you could say, could you show me your grades? If you're unsure, because these days kids don't always get work home. Sometimes you may not know. But I wouldn't look at the homework portal without your child. I would always do it with the child. And before you do it, you got to talk to yourself. All right, I am not going to pass judgment. I am not going to bark at my child or get in an argument about this. I'm simply going to look and acknowledge and maybe ask a few questions. But I would trust and verify. If your child has a history of not turning things in and perpetually being behind, I would trust that this year is going to be better, but I would also verify that they are staying on track.
Great, thank you, Ann. Another parent asked, which online resource, Google Keep, Focus Booster, or Forest, do you recommend most for high school age students?
For high school age students, I would say it depends, honestly, what is most distracting to them. Like some kids, it's their phone. And I'd say Forest. Some kids, it's that they don't know what to do and they're not keeping track of all the to-dos. Then it's probably Google Keep. So it kind of depends on the student. But I might ask them, I might have a conversation. What do you feel is holding you up? Like, what is the biggest challenge thus far? And let them tell you instead of you trying to figure it out for them. An older student should be able to tell you, I'm having difficulty in this. And if you don't want to have that dialogue with your child, that's something you can talk to a teacher about, a tutor, an executive function coach. There's lots of other people that can have the conversation if you're worried that it's just going to result in lots of tension and argument.
And Ann, there's a question, I think earlier in the session in the Q&A, I just found a couple of questions. I think you had a slide that showed executive functions, and the question was whether or not those were all of the executive functions.
Well, there's certainly different ways to dice up executive functions. Some people will say there's 6, some people will say there are 12, but those are generally what they are. When I think of what is an executive function, it's basically your ability to plan a task and execute it. Plan and execute. That is what it is in a nutshell. Many parents will say, well, difficulty with that sounds like ADHD. What's the difference? And it does. People with ADHD always have executive function weaknesses, but not everybody with some garden variety executive function weaknesses, which is what a lot of people have, meet the criteria for ADHD. But in general, when you look at all those criteria, you'll see that there is often overlap with ADHD.
Okay, great. And then I think we have one more question, which was, how do you move the student from what is the one thing that you need to accomplish to sharing any other assignments that might be due? So I guess maybe if it sounds like this parent maybe wants to know everything that's on the plate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I might ask myself, is that necessary? Is my child able to get most of the work done without me, wanting to know everything? And is the question really because I'm nervous? Is it serving my child the best? And I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, but there's actually research on, and not that this mom or dad is doing this at all, but it just made me think. There's research that looked at the way in which we help kids with homework. And it's fascinating because you would think like, oh, if you're super involved with your child, they're going to naturally do better in school. But actually the research shows that parents that are uber involved, their kids actually do worse in school because the kids start to lose self-confidence and they don't think that they can do it on their own. So I guess I might ask myself, do I really need to know everything? Or is my child capable of doing some of these things on his own? Um, and you can also ask the question, if you're nervous about the other things, what are your priorities today? So that it's not just like, what's the one thing? It's what might you do first, second, and possibly third? I use that question a lot with kids, especially older kids, because it's more than one thing, as we all know. And again, they may not tell you out loud, well, it's this, that, and the other thing, but it does rev up their executive function skills to try to think through the first few things.
All righty. Well, I think I don't see any additional questions in the chat, or actually, I just got one popping in the Q&A. Oh, how can we support a kindergartner with transitions like going from dinner to showering? That's a good question.
Yeah, dinner to showering. Oh gosh. Well, here's the thing about really young kids. We expect them to have actually kind of good working memory, and young children have terrible working memory. So working memory is actually your ability to juggle multiple things in your head at the same time. Here's an example. Hey, Jimmy, go up to your room, get your coat on, get your mittens, and don't forget to brush your teeth. So now you've said to your kids, coat, mittens, teeth. Okay, the chance of them doing coat, mittens, and teeth is like, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's like a 1. They're probably not, if they're impacted at all with ADHD or executive functions, you're probably going to go upstairs in 20 minutes because they haven't come downstairs, and they're going to be playing with Legos because they've forgotten about the 3 things. So whenever we want our kids to do a task that's reoccurring, like you do this every morning, we have to put it in writing, and we have to put it in a place that they're going to see it. So for example, if we want them to go from, I don't know, getting up in the morning to getting dressed before they go downstairs, we might, on a little piece of a notebook paper or a Post-it note or something, put 3 pictures of the things that we want them to do, or maybe it's 2 things with the word next to it. Kids have to have a visual. And also remember, if they see that visual over and over again, after about 2 weeks, it loses effectiveness. You have to sparkleize it. That's a term from my friend Ari Tuckman. He's fabulous. And he says, you got to sparkleize it because it just kind of blends in with the wall. So you might have to like put it on a piece of paper. It was on the left of the door, put it on the right of the door, make it different. And kids will then again notice it.
All right, so we're having a little flurry of last minute questions, and I don't know how much more time you have. But I think this question, I think probably many of us have struggled with. What's the best way to respond if a child has lied about turning in an assignment or finishing a project? Curious how you balance managing a child's anxiety with the consequences of their decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I try not, I've had that. I mean, as a mother myself, I've had my kids lie to me many times. I've had kids that I've worked with lie to me, a lot. It's kind of when kids feel backed into a corner, they will lie because they don't know any other way out. So I like having a discussion around it instead of saying, why did you lie to me? Again, that's a why question. It's very hard for kids to process that and reply. Instead, I might say, tell me about that. When you said that, tell me what you were thinking. Does that worry you? And I would just start asking them questions and have a discussion around it, and really hear how they're feeling as well.
All right, and how much more, I don't know if you want to tackle a few more questions or if
Sure, I'm happy to. And then I'd love for everybody to stay on because I want to recap at the very end too.
Oh, great. Okay, so we'll keep going. So somebody asked again about the specific name of the Focus Booster app. They couldn't find it in the App Store. So I don't know if we want to just look through that in the chat later or.
I believe it's just Focus Booster. I can put that in the, when I send out the recording, I can add that to it if that's helpful.
Okay, so we can send those resources.
Yeah.
That sounds great. Tips for how to get students to plan long-term assignments and not wait until the last minute. Back to that procrastination.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because planning ahead and also self-awareness, those are some of the last executive function skills that come online. Task initiation is actually much easier for kids, like making themselves get started, because that's really short term, but your brain's ability to say, oh, that's due in 2 weeks. I'm going to plan it out like that. That's actually very difficult for kids. And that's why we see kids struggle with it so much. And so that's where that question, what are your first steps in getting that done? But what I've personally found and worked with lots of kids over the years is that, creating lots of lists or asking them to write down all the steps or tell me all the things that you have to do. Or when kids create lists for themselves, it's not that effective. What's way more effective is when they take their calendar and they figure out, okay, today after school, I have cross practice, I have this big block of time, and then I have an AP meeting, whatever it is. With that block of time, if they can schedule in what they want to do, it's super powerful. So just asking kids, what are your first steps? Is there anything I can help with in terms of getting supplies? There's nothing worse than something's due on Thursday. Like, I can't tell you how many kids I've worked with, and the parents are like ready to kill them because they've got this like diorama or something due on Thursday, and then Wednesday night they're asking to go to Michael's at 8 o'clock and get all the craft supplies. So we want to try to avoid that as much as possible. So asking them early on, what are the steps you need to do this? For little kids, I've done things like if they like baseball cards, I've asked them, what are the 4 steps you need to get this done, this book report done? Oh, well, I have to read the book, then I have to do this worksheet, then I have to do this. I'm like, okay, great. So I'm going to take the stack of baseball cards, I'm going to break it into 4 different little sets. And each time you complete one set, you get that little stack of baseball cards. So it makes something that's super abstract really concrete for younger kids.
All right. And I think we only have one more question, which is, what is the best age to start a child off with an executive functioning coach? And is 4th grade too young?
I don't think it's too young. I think the 4th grade is actually a really good pivotal year to get kids developing habits. It's much harder to change habits when kids are older. So for a 4th grader, if they're struggling with these things, that's a great time to get started, and also to implement some things at home, not just with schoolwork, but other parts of the life that can be beneficial for the student too.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much to everybody who joined us. Would love your comments in the chat about whether you're still finding these virtual sessions helpful. We technically have the ability to have live sessions, but I do think, especially in the evening, these are often easier. So we're planning to continue doing those. Huge thank you to Ann. And every time I listen to you, I think back about my own kids and think, gee, I wish I'd done that when my kids were younger. And I just feel as they always have great new information. So I can't thank you enough for all these great practical tips that I think help kids do well and be successful, but also really that focus on maintaining relationships is so important. And you're so gifted in how you share this. So thank you.
You're sweet. Thanks, Kathleen. So I have a favor to ask everybody. I'm wondering what was helpful to you tonight? If you could think of one thing, here, let me share this. Hold on. One takeaway, what was helpful to you? What did you learn tonight? What did you take away tonight? And put it in the chat. That would be fabulous. I'd love to read them out because it really helps to solidify the information when you hear what other people are thinking too. So just go ahead and put your takeaway in the chat right now. I'll read them out. Google Keep. Practical tips on how to dialogue with your kids. Super helpful. Thanks for doing this. It's really helpful. I think using a Pomodoro or the timer would help my middle schooler. The apps, the prompts and the questions, strategies on putting structure, better ways to ask questions, the weekly planner, Pomodoro, how to get started, and choosing just one method. I noticed tips for managing procrastination, praising effort versus outcome. Yes, the rating scale and talking about the anxious child, how to approach a situation without asking why, the Forest app, how to reword questions, don't look backwards, how to phrase questions for better communication. I'm going to help my child develop a habit of previewing the week and calendaring out tasks. Pomodoro, remembering to avoid why questions. The real reasons kids Procrastinate. Google Keep Pomodoro. Lots of things. Awesome. Tips for conversation and communication. And somebody said sparkle eyes. So I'm so glad that was helpful. Thank you, everyone, for being a part this evening. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out at any time. And you can get the information on all of the communication techniques by texting 55444 and the word communication. Have a great evening, everybody. And thank you so much, Kathleen, for having me on tonight.
Thank you, Ann. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye. Kathleen, I'm going to sign off.